Okay, it's 6:02, so let's get going, and people can always join us later. So as you saw when you joined this meeting, this presentation is being recorded. So mostly it'll just be the presentation and me talking, but just so you know, if you come off mute and have your camera on to ask a question or anything, you would be part of the recording. So feel free to put in the chat if you have any questions, if you don't want to be on the recording. And you can choose if you want to have your camera on or off. So totally up to you. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here to talk about forest planning. I'm really excited to talk to you all about forest planning and some things that are going on right now on the Lolo National Forest. So just a kind of quick agenda for the evening. We'll go over just a bit about forest planning, why it's important, some details about what's going on specifically on the Lolo National Forest, some of our recommendations at this stage in the process, how to write a good comment, and then we'll have lots of time for questions, and of course, time to actually get into the details and spend time writing comments to the Forest Service. So my name is Maddie Munson, and I am Wild Montana's Public Lands Director. I focus on a lot of our work with the federal agencies, like the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. So I spend a lot of time thinking about forest planning, and I'm excited to share some information with you all. I'm going to just try something new here, and I'm going to launch a poll very quickly. Da, da, da. Okay. Hopefully you are all seeing a poll. Matei, I'm looking at you. Can you nod if you see a poll on your screen? Okay, fantastic. So I would love to know, because we have quite a few faces in this room that I'm not sure if I know or not, how you would kind of rate yourself on the forest planning scale in terms of your knowledge. One being you just saw the phrase forest planning in the name of this meeting and have no idea what we were talking about. And five being like you're a total expert, could teach a class on it. So somewhere or someplace in the middle, I'm expecting there'll probably be some folks in there. But just so we can get kind of a sense of who's in the room, and what kind of knowledge we have here. Just a few more seconds. Okay. Great. Thank you all for doing that. So I hope I can share these results. Looks like we're kind of split between 2, 3, and 4 here, if you all can see that. So we have, yeah, pretty good split between folks who have maybe heard of the term forest planning, but don't really know the process. Some folks who have a good understanding of some of the basics, and some more knowledgeable folks. So we'll just close that. Thank you all for doing that quick poll. It's helpful for me to know going into this. We're definitely going to stop throughout for questions so that there's lots of time. And please don't hesitate to ask a question if you have it, or if you want some more clarification or an example or something that we talk about. I would say for those of you that are more on the 4-5 scale of the poll, if you really want to get into a deep diving into some really nuanced things or wonky things, maybe hold those types of questions to the end when we have some time set aside, and then we can go look at all the documents and get into the real nitty-gritty details. So first and foremost, what even is a forest plan? What are we talking about here, and why does it matter? Every national forest across the entire country is required to have a management plan, and these management plans are most commonly known as forest plans. These plans basically guide everything that happens in the forest, and you can think of these kind of like zoning. So they provide high-level standards for what kind of uses might be appropriate across a forest, and then they also provide guidelines that the Forest Service has to consider, and some different kind of sideboard constraints for different things. A forest plan does not make any kind of specific project level decisions that would actually have impacts directly on the ground. So for example, you might see like a timber project or a project that has road construction or trail construction. That's a different kind of process that happens later. And all of those projects have to comply with this big overarching management plan. And so that's why it's a really critical process, because it really does set the stage for everything that's going to happen in the forest, all types of projects and activities that the Forest Service proposes. And these forest plans, they have to be revised. It's supposed to happen every 15 years, and it usually takes quite a lot longer than that. So these are really in place, really anywhere from 15 to like 40 years. So it's really important when we have these opportunities, when they are getting revised, to provide input, and that way we can kind of shape the management decisions that the Forest Service will make for the next 15 to 40 years. So there's a pretty big time frame here. Okay, so when the Forest Service goes to revise one of these forest plans, the process is subject to a statute that's called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA is the short acronym that you might hear. And this statute requires that federal agencies analyze potential impacts from all of their decisions and also make sure that the public has really important opportunities to provide input to the Forest Service through submitting comments. And this happens during distinct different planning phases. And so it created a little timeline here of the different phases of the Forest Service analysis process. The very first phase is called the assessment. Whoop, that's a map. Here we go. Whoop, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. The very first phase is called the assessment. And this is basically like an info gathering phase. This is where the Forest Service will look at the previous plan. We'll kind of take a look at things on the ground and what may have changed since then, and gathers lots of information about things that they're going to want to consider going forward. The next phase is called scoping, or proposed action. This is essentially the first rough draft of the plan that outlines kind of the framework and some of the issues that the Forest Service is going to think about when they really dive into their actual analysis. So it's kind of setting the stage for everything, and is the first look at how the plan is coming together. The next phase is called the draft environmental impact statement. And this is really like the meat, the heart of the forest planning process, this phase here. So the Forest Service will put forward a suite of different alternatives for the plan. There's usually 4 to 6, which will analyze, and then they'll analyze how each of those different alternatives may impact the environment. And each alternative will vary in how the Forest Service is thinking about managing the forest. So there's often one that has more conservation outcomes, one that has less conservation pieces, and then some kind of varying things in the middle around different uses across the forest. So they'll kind of look at a bunch of different options. They'll analyze all of them and how they might affect resources on the forest. And they usually choose one that's called their preferred alternative. And that will kind of indicate which way the Forest Service might be leaning when they're looking at all of these different alternatives. And then next up, we have the final environmental impact statement phase. This is similar to the draft phase, but it's kind of a more polished version at this point. They take into consideration all of the information that they've gathered from the first 3 phases, and everything should be kind of at the very end, everything's polished, ready to go. And then finally, they put out their final plan, their final record of decision, they call it. And that's when the plan is ready to roll. It's all done, and then they start implementing it. And that will be in place for at least the next 15 years, if not much longer. And there are official public comment opportunities at each of the first of the 4 phases here of this process. And it's really critical here that people get involved at some of these official phases of the process, because at each of these, the Forest Service is required to consider the public input that it receives, and then they have to respond to it during the next phase. So they won't say like, Maddie said, consider plants, but they'll say like, a lot of people talked about native plants and how we should really consider that. And then they'll respond to it in the next phase of the plan. So they do take into consideration people's feedback, and there are real people reading everyone's comments coming into the agency. So I'm going to just pause really quickly because I realized that was a lot of information about the basics of forest planning, and see if there are any questions here before we talk about what's actually happening on the Lolo National Forest. So feel free to either put something in the chat. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the little chat icon that you can click on and send a message, or you can come off of mute if you have a forest planning question before we continue. So I'll just give you a second to think. Okay, hearing none, we'll continue on. So the Lolo National Forest, which is why we're all here, just to talk about this forest. This is a map of the Lolo National Forest here in orange. The Lolo National Forest covers over 2 million acres in western Montana, along the Idaho border and around Missoula. And so, here's kind of the same timeline as before, but with the Lolo. So the Lolo Forest Plan that's currently in effect is from 1986. So you might remember that I said it often takes longer than 15 years, and this is definitely one of those cases. This plan is almost 40 years old. And I know that some of the folks here also know that in 2006, the Forest Service tried to revise this plan. They basically got up to the second scoping proposed action phase, but some of the policies that the Forest Service was using at this time ended up getting overturned in court. And so the Forest Service had to go back to the drawing board and basically kind of revamp some of their policies that they finalized around 2012. And then now they're coming back to start this revision process over again. So they are taking into consideration some of the things and analysis that happened back in 2006, but also because some of the policies have changed, it's a somewhat of a newer process. And so, yeah, here we are in 2024 at the scoping proposed action stage. Last year in 2023, they had a bunch of public meetings. They gathered a lot of input from the public and from other stakeholder groups, just kind of figuring out what they wanted to change since the 1986 plan and how things were looking on the ground. And now we are at this scoping phase, the second phase. The documents were released on January 31st, and the public has a 60-day comment window to submit comments on the documents that came out. So that means that comments are due on April 1st. And so because this is the second kind of scoping proposed action phase of the timeline, we have to keep in mind that this is just kind of the first rough draft of the plan that's identifying some different issues. So we don't have quite all of the analysis that we want just yet, but we have this great opportunity to tell the Forest Service what kind of things they should consider moving forward. Okay, so the Lolo plan has a few different management areas established in the plan. The first, and these are pretty similar across a lot of other forests, because I know some of you have worked on like the Custer Gallatin plan or the Kootenai National Forest plan, and these are kind of similar across all forests. So the first one being recommended wilderness. Only Congress can designate wilderness, but the Forest Service can recommend areas for wilderness and then manage them to maintain their wilderness characteristics. These areas generally do not allow motorized use and mechanized use like mountain biking, and they have some limits on development, usually around road construction and commercial timber harvest, things like that. Backcountry areas, it's kind of what the name sounds like. These are more remote backcountry parts of the forest that are less developed areas. And these can be either motorized or non-motorized. It's up to the Forest Service, but mountain biking is allowed in this type of designation. And this also has the same kind of limits on development, especially around road construction and commercial timber harvest, same kind of thing. Next, there is concentrated recreation use. Again, kind of sounds like what it is in the name. This is the area where the main management focus is really on recreation, and the plan will have components for trail maintenance and recreation infrastructure, things like that. And then lastly, there's general forest, which is basically everything that wasn't encapsulated in the first three management areas. And of course, there's other kind of constraints and different layers and things that go on top. It's not just whatever the Forest Service wants, but these are managed for a wide range of different uses. Okay. And there are some parts of forest planning, some different types of areas that kind of provide like a baseline management. And these are fixed designations that the forest planning process cannot change. They have to be incorporated into the plan. One of the first main types of areas are inventoried roadless areas. These are areas that were designated in the early 2000s where there cannot be road construction or timber harvest activities generally. And one of the reasons why it's important to know about this is that the forest planning process cannot change these areas, but they often do provide kind of the boundaries that make up some of the management areas that I just talked about. So you'll often see like the same boundaries for an inventory roadless area parcel might have a backcountry area right over the top of that same alignment. So that's important to know. There are also, of course, two congressionally designated areas. There are national recreation areas, which really focus on recreation opportunities. Um, and places with significant natural and scenic resources. And there are also wilderness areas that were designated to preserve natural ecosystems and values and provide opportunities for solitude and primitive recreation. So those types of things, they'll be included in the plan, but they can't change that much of the underlying management because these were kind of separately designated areas. So in addition to management areas, there are so many other different types of plan components to guide management. Basically, every resource that you could imagine off the top of your head, wildlife and plant species, habitat, sustainable recreation, cultural and historic resources, pretty much everything across the forest has separate plan components. And these are usually, they have kind of multiple parts. Part of it will be aspirational goal language. So the Forest Service can say, like, we hope in 20 years that this area will look like XYZ. And there can also be more binding requirements where they say the Forest Service has to consider, how many roads are in this specific area to provide for habitat. So they can kind of be more aspirational or they can be binding, and there's a lot of information there. Um, the Lolo is also undertaking a new kind of analysis that I'm really excited about, where they're modeling connectivity across the forest to see if they need some additional plan components for connectivity. The Lolo has a lot of great habitat for wildlife, and so this is something that they're really keeping in mind. And because we're at this early phase, basically all we know at this point is that they're going to be doing some kind of new analysis. They're thinking about connectivity, and kind of stay tuned at the next phase for what that might look like. Okay, I'm going to pause again before we get into actual specific areas on the forest. There are obviously a lot of resources and values and special areas that we can't cover tonight because you all would have to be with me for like an entire day for us to go over all of the things. But these are just some questions you might want to keep in mind as we're talking about some specific areas. So you can kind of start mulling over, what type of things you might want to include to your comment to the Forest Service. So it's always really important to think about what your favorite places in the forest might be, or what kind of activities or values are important to you. So if you've never been to the Lolo, you could always talk about, if you care about wildlife or hiking opportunities or whatever it might be. You can kind of think about that and areas that are important to you. And at the end of when we get through all the different specific sections, I'll also share that as a typed up handout. So you don't have to worry about memorizing everything that I'm saying when we get to the actual comment writing part. But I'm just going to pause again to see if there are any questions thus far. Okay. One question that I got in the chat is if things like wilderness and recreation areas are more fixed in forest planning, how does management of aspects of these wilderness and recreation areas change? How do permitting levels get set or trail maintenance or recreational infrastructure needs get established? That's a really good question. So for most of these areas, there are other management plans that they have to work in conjunction with, which is where this process can get kind of confusing. So for a lot of wilderness areas, I guess I should take a step back. In forest planning, they can talk about kind of how they generally see things laid out for either wilderness or national recreation areas. And so the Forest Service can kind of put in these constraints, like wilderness, they'll say these areas are not suitable for motorized use, for mountain biking, for some of these different vegetation treatments that might want to happen here. And they kind of set out that suitability. For both wilderness and recreation areas, there are separate management plans that usually get more into the weeds of like, we will allow a certain amount of outfitters and guides to go out in this area during a season. And so they'll get much more established in that either other management plan level or at a project level. They'll talk about that. In terms of trail infrastructure or infrastructure needs, again, the forest plan will likely say something like, the Forest Service will prioritize maintenance for these areas or facilities that we might need adjacent to the recreation area, and kind of have more aspirational language. But in terms of actual projects of like, are they going to put in another outhouse or more maps or more signage, that is a separate kind of project level decision. I'm not sure if that answered your question very well. Any other questions before we continue on? Okay, silent group, you're just going to keep listening to me. Here we go. So this map, is it here? Oh yeah, there it goes. This map here is the proposed action map. So this is what came out from the Forest Service at the end of July. This is what we're commenting on. And there are basically different colored blobs on the map that mean different things. So I have a separate computer over here, so I'm just going to try to draw over here. Okay, so designated wilderness is dark green. So those are these areas here in dark green. Recommended wilderness is lime green. So those are these areas here. The backcountry areas, those are in yellow on this map. And again, those can be motorized or non-motorized, but you have to go and look at other different parts of the plan to decipher whether that's the case or not. But here in a minute, I'm going to kind of zoom in on different sections of the map so we can go over that piece. And then the light pink is general forest. I'm not going to circle that. That's like a lot of the forest areas. And then dark purple is concentrated recreation use. So yeah, I'm going to zoom in on some different areas across the forest. Again, this is going to be kind of more high level, what Wild Montana is recommending that you include in comments at this point, and kind of what our recommendations are and what we'd like to see the Forest Service include at that next draft environmental impact statement phase. But yeah, there'll be lots of time once we go through all of this, we can kind of go more in depth about some of the proposals and some of the different areas. And so first up, we're going to go kind of from the western part of the map down and around to the eastern part of the map. So we're going to start in the far northwest corner. Well, hold on. The drawing tool messed up my slideshow. Oh no. The circles still exist. Hold on 1 second. Okay, problem solved. Yes, okay. Great. So first up is the Q-Bar and Silcox area, which is one of these areas where there are the different little roadless area pieces that already exist. And then the Forest Service has a backcountry area designation over the top. And there are 3 particular parts of this landscape that we're really interested in. This is right outside of Thompson Falls Trout Creek. And that's the Cataract roadless area here. You can see my mouse. The Q-Bar and Silcox roadless area here, and the Sundance Ridge roadless area. And so, like I said, the Forest Service is initially proposing to manage these areas as non-motorized backcountry. Sorry, something weird came up on my computer. Non-motorized backcountry. And this area is one of those places where it's really important for connectivity. It is a vital wildlife corridor connecting the Cabinet Mountains to the north, the Bitterroots, and the Mission Mountain Wilderness. And we are working with a local group, the Q-Bar and Cataract Coalition, to try to ask the Forest Service to recommend this area for recommended wilderness, to protect some of the special values of this area, including this connectivity piece. And I do see that Doug Farrell is here with us, who is one of the co-founders of Q-Bar and Cataract Coalition. So I'm just going to stop for a second and see, Doug, do you want to say anything before I continue on?
Hi, everybody.
Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, this is great. Appreciate it, Maddie. One thing I might mention is the Cube Iron area is a roadless area, and the Sundance Ridge area is a roadless area that don't quite meet together, but there is roadless country between them. And so our proposal includes a combination of the Cube Iron and the Sundance Ridge roadless areas to be recommended for wilderness. And this won't really change the existing management much at all. It's all non-motorized today. Um, and wilderness would really just make a more permanent protection for this area. One exception is that if it's not recommended wilderness, it could be open to bicycles and motorized bikes. And wilderness designation keeps the trails quiet and safe for um, stock and horses and mules and so on. Anyway, really appreciate your support on endorsing this area as a great candidate for wilderness. It's really some spectacular country. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Doug. Okay, moving right along, over just to the east, there's the Reservation Divide area, which is essentially this very skinny little roadless area along the Flathead Reservation. Again, this is an important piece that's connecting multiple ecosystems. And you might remember kind of at the outset, I talked about how in 2006, the Forest Service started this revision process. It was paused, and now they're kind of restarting revising the whole plan. And this is an area that in 2006, the Forest Service did their wilderness evaluation analysis, and they decided that this area could be recommended for wilderness. And so we would like the Forest Service to recommend this area for wilderness again, like they originally proposed back in 2006. Um, just moving on. We have just over to the west is the Great Burn String of Pearls area, which many of you might be familiar with. The heart of the Great Burn is the Hoodoo Roadless area, which is here in lime green. The Forest Service initially has proposed to retain the recommended wilderness boundaries from that original 1986 plan. And then the String of Pearls are basically a whole slew of really beautiful roadless areas all along the Idaho-Montana border that are a mixed they're all backcountry areas, and they're a mix of some motorized, some non-motorized backcountry areas. And there are two that we're especially interested in: Ward Eagle, which is this little blob up here, and Meadow Creek Upper North Fork, which is just this little section here of yellow. And so again, we are working with some of our partners at the Great Burn Conservation Alliance, which is another local group that's based out of Missoula, on these recommendations for the Forest Service. The Hoodoo Roadless area, the one that's recommended for wilderness right now, is especially important, and we really support the Forest Service having those boundaries, keeping those boundaries in place like they have been for the past 40 years. This is one of the largest and most intact landscapes in the entire lower 48. And so we really want to keep it that way for future generations and all of the wildlife that use this area. And then for those two little roadless areas that I pointed out on the map, we're recommended wilderness for those little sections as well. Okay, moving just a little bit south, we have the Lolo Creek area. You're gonna have to bear with me for a second because there is a lot going on for kind of a small section of land. So we have a part here, you can see my mouse, yeah, you can. A section here in dark green, which is the designated Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area. So again, that management, oh, there we go. Okay, that management can't really change. It's designated wilderness. We have basically a cap of recommended wilderness here in lime green. And that recommended wilderness is the same recommended wilderness area as what existed back in 1986. So it's the same boundary. And then the rest of this area here in yellow is just kind of the roadless area that's in backcountry designation. And part of the backcountry designation is, moving over to this other map, is a research natural area, which I have not talked about yet. But this is kind of another type of designation where the Forest Service preserves smaller sections of land to preserve these areas for their ecosystem integrity and kind of protecting these for research and study. And so right now the Forest Service is proposing to expand this research natural area just a little bit to this black box blob here to the left. And so again, we're working with the Friends of Lolo Peak, which is another kind of smaller group based out of Missoula. And we're really happy that the Forest Service is initially proposing to retain that little cap of 1986 recommended wilderness and expand the research natural area. This research natural area is really important because it has special white bark pine and alpine larch ecosystems. And so our recommendation for here, again, following that 2006 start of a forest plan, I'm going to go back to the map here, is just to extend this recommended wilderness boundary so that it meets up with the research natural area to make sure that those values that are found in the research natural area are fully protected. And like I said, this is all written down and I will share. So hopefully you're not trying to take 1,000 notes or anything while I'm talking. Okay, the rattlesnake. This is another like very unique situation. Like I said, this was designated by Congress in 1980. And so right now, the Forest Service proposed action has kind of a multiple things happening. We have the designated wilderness here in the dark green. We have the concentrated recreation area in dark purple. And there's also a little bit of general forest for the road corridor and also backcountry area over to the right. So it's kind of like all the different types of management combined in one. And what we're hoping that the Forest Service will do and what they originally did in 2006 is they created its own special, unique management area where they said, like, this is its own thing that's been designated by Congress. So it doesn't really make sense for it to be, backcountry and recreation area and all these other things, but instead having one special type of management area that includes the designated wilderness and has more information about why it was originally designated in 1980, including some more explicit language in those standards around road construction not being allowed in the recreation area or commercial timber activity. Okay. Another kind of lots of different things happening in this area. This is the Blackfoot watershed around Ovando and Seeley Lake. We have designated wilderness over here in dark green. That's the scapegoat. Lime green is all recommended wilderness that follows the same kind of boundaries as the original 1986 plan. Yellow is backcountry, and this is predominantly non-motorized backcountry in this area. And if you have been with Wild Montana for a while, you've probably heard about the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act. It's a piece of legislation, that we've been working on for many, many years now, that would add 80,000 acres to the Bob Marshall, Scapegoat, and Mission Mountain Wilderness and protect the Blackfoot River. And so we're hoping that the Forest Service, and we're asking the Forest Service to kind of mirror all of these pieces of this collaborative agreement that's, folks have been working on for 20 years in their forest plan designation. So that way everything aligns and is of the same kind of management, the forest plan and the legislation. So here is a map of the legislation, and there's two kind of key pieces for recommended wilderness that the Forest Service did not include in their original documents. And that is this little arm section up here that I circled in yellow for the Grizzly Basin of the Swan Range, and over here in the West Fork of the Clearwater. So we're asking the Forest Service to mirror all of the aspects of the legislation, including recommending those chunks for recommended wilderness. Okay, this is the last one, I promise. This is the Rock Creek Quig area, which is kind of down by Clinton. Those of you who are familiar with Rock Creek, it goes right here through the middle of all of these different roadless area pieces. We have the main kind of Quig, well, actually I should say first up here, which I did not label in dark green, we have the Welcome Creek Wilderness area. Then in lime green, we have the main Quig roadless area. And then the lime green is also recommended wilderness. And then backcountry for the other roadless areas, including the Stony Mountain one. And so the boundary for that original chunk there in the middle, the lime green, that one aligns with what was in the 1986 plan. And we're hoping that they also would recommend the extra little section off to the side, Stony Mountain, which is something that they included in the 2006 plan. And it's really kind of a critical piece. Sorry, I'm going to go back to the map one more time. Really kind of a critical piece here because you have Welcome Creek Wilderness up to the north. You have this recommended wilderness area here. And then it's right in between both the Bitterroot National Forest and the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest and some of the wildlands there. And so it's really important to keep these areas all roadless so that they can protect some of those important values for this Rock Creek watershed, which I think some of you are probably familiar with. It's a blue ribbon trout stream and is really fantastic. So that's that last piece there. Okay, that is the end of all of these specific things. So now we're going to get into comments. I'm just going to make this brief and then we'll do another round for questions and discussion and things. So comments are due on April 1st at 11:59 p.m. I highly recommend you do not wait until the last hour or two to submit your comments because these portals are notoriously finicky. And the Forest Service does prefer that you write your comments to their kind of portal that they've created on their website. And I'm going to just put that right here in the chat. And this will come up again, but portal. Okay, so this is the portal where you can submit your comments. You can also handwrite your comments and mail them to the Forest Service at this address here. And I'm going to put this information in a document here in just a second. One more thing about the portal and going back to the technology finicky piece. I also recommend that you write your comments in some kind of other window, whether that's like a Google Doc or a Word document or the Notes app on your iPad, something like that, where you can write out all of your thoughts and then you can either copy and paste that into the portal or you can attach it directly to the portal. If you start writing straight into this Forest Service website, if anything happens, it will not save what you wrote. So you might want to just do it someplace else. Oops, that's the wrong one. There we go. So some thoughts for writing your actual comment. So comment should be addressed to the plan revision team lead. Her name is Amanda Milburn. It's always good to be respectful in your comment and keep in mind that these will be part of the public record. So once this process kind of wraps up after the Forest Service will create a whole record of all the comments that's submitted, and you can go in and look at all of them. So it's good to keep that in mind. You don't want to say anything that's like sensitive information or anything like that. And like I said originally, there are real Forest Service employees that are reading this. It's not AI or something like that. So it's always good to be respectful. I always like to start by thanking the Forest Service for their time and any things that we think that they did right. And it's a good way to kind of start your letter. And then going from there, it's kind of what I said earlier. Some things to consider are, talking a little bit about who you are, why you're actually interested in this process, whether it's that you live near the forest, you like to recreate on the forest, or you just really care about wildlife or wildland values, whatever it might be. You can always share your personal experiences. That really makes these personal because it is a real person reading it. So I think that they like to hear, why it's important to you and why you care about it. And then you can go into any recommendations you have for Forest Service management. And this can kind of be as simple or as technical as you feel like. For me, it could be as simple as something like, thank you so much for your time for writing this proposed action. I'm originally from Idaho and now I live in Montana, and I really love public lands because I love to hike and see wildlife and pick huckleberries. And I want to make sure that your management plan preserves those opportunities for quiet recreation and opportunities where I can see wildlife. And I had a great time this summer hiking in the Great Burn, and I want to make sure that that area stays the way it is for generations to come. Like your comment can be as simple as that, or you can get really into the weeds for the type of management that you want to see. And so I am going to put now into the chat a few different things. I'm going to put a link to the proposed action map that we shared earlier. And then I've created two different handouts. Both handouts, the very first page is the same information. It's kind of like the basic information about where we are in the process, where to submit your comments, when they are due, the link to get to the web page again, that kind of thing. And then they differ. I created one handout that has just like a few bullet point sentences of like our top recommendations if you just kind of need an idea of where to start. And then I created another handout where I essentially wrote out everything that I just covered. So like, what does the proposed action say for some of these areas? What kind of recommendation do we want to provide? And so that way you can kind of choose your own adventure of how technical you want to get. So give me just 1 second while I do that, and I'll put these into the chat. And then hoping if there's some questions, we can talk about questions. Or if folks just want to dive right into writing some comments, I'm here if questions arise, or we can discuss any kind of issues that might come up for folks. But the rest of the time for the evening, I've really envisioned as just kind of like open chit chat space for folks who want to talk about their comments. So any questions coming to people's mind at this point? Okay, I see your questions coming in. One second. Keep thinking about it. Okay. Zach has a really good question, which comes up a lot in conversations, which is because these plans can last 40 years, it's really difficult to foresee problems that could arise at that time. For example, there wasn't much to address about climate change in 1986. Is there a way to comment so that the forest may be responsive to things in the future? Yes, I think that it kind of depends on the specific topic. So there is definitely, because this is pretty high level, we have to think, we can't be too specific with things. Hold on 1 second, my other computer is having an issue. Thinking about, there we go. Sorry, what was I gonna say? One part that comes to mind especially is like emerging technologies is something that we comment on a lot. And so thinking about like, how do we want them to manage recommended wilderness? We usually say like, we'd really like you to manage recommended wilderness so that, there's no motorized use and no mechanized use. We call that no non-conforming uses. And something that we talk about a lot is emerging technologies. So we'll say like, and there are likely technologies that we can't anticipate now. Like in 1986, we could not anticipate e-bikes, for example, or drones or whatever. And so making sure that there are kind of like factors that the Forest Service thinks about when they're creating their standards. So like for recommended wilderness, it's like making sure that whatever kind of uses are allowed maintain those wilderness characteristics and have to maybe go through some kind of separate site specific process if there's something specific. That wasn't really that good of an example. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, so I think it kind of depends on the specific example. Yeah, that's not a very good answer. Let me keep thinking about that for a second, Zach. 1 second. Okay, another example that just came to mind is thinking about things, if we are thinking about like climate change, is trying to kind of anticipate how that might affect things, not necessarily in a specific way, but thinking about like habitat connectivity. It's likely that like some species ranges might change based off of climate change, or they might need to move around in different patterns than they originally thought. And so I think that you can always ask the Forest Service in that kind of sense around, making sure that those pieces of the plan are forward thinking and to kind of provide flexibility down the line. So saying like, yeah, I don't know if I can say the specific language off the top of my head that you might want to propose, but saying like, I agree that connectivity is going to be really important and continue to be important, over the lifespan of this plan. And therefore, like, I really want the Forest Service to be thinking about forward-thinking plan components that might account for differences in migration patterns or changes of some species moving to higher elevations or something like that. So I think that could be an example too. But if you have a specific question, like a specific part of the plan you were thinking of, let me know. Aaron asked about, will Lolo Peak Trail now pass for the new Carlton Ridge RNA? Let me just confirm on the map really quick before I give you my answer on that. Any other questions that are coming up for folks? Anything? You can also come off of mute and chit chat so people aren't just listening to me if you want. Oh, hi, Zach. I see your hand up. I'm calling on you.
Thanks. Hi, Maddie. So I live in Great Falls,
Mhm.
and in the 2010s,
Mhm.
Congress designated conservation management areas on the Rocky Mountain front.
Mhm.
Are there any ever instances of like recommending those in forest plans, or are those like only done via Congress?
That's a good question. I have not seen that kind of designation specifically recommended in a forest plan before. I know you're also one of the experts on forest planning, so I'm wondering if this was a posed question and you know the answer. Um, I can't think of an example off the top of my head where that's been the case because no, I think it has to be congressional. I think that the Forest Service can kind of set the baseline for that. Like they could say, these are areas that we're going to focus on conservation. Yeah, I think that they could kind of set like what maybe the baseline management would be for some of these areas. And then, okay. And then the forest and then Congress can kind of, what often happens, I think is maybe a better way to say this, is the Forest Service will say like, these are kind of the uses that we think might be appropriate for different areas of the forest. And sometimes then Congress can come in and legislate of some of the forest plan components or whatever. But in terms of actual like a new type of designation, I've never seen that before. You could, like over in the Custer Gallatin, we were part of the Gallatin Forest Partnership, which is a collaborative group that came together with some different types of areas, and they basically created like a backcountry area. Um, they created like a backcountry designation that went into forest planning and that laid out like we don't want any motorized use in these areas and no trail construction and those types of pieces that now they're working on getting those to be legislated. But like the Forest Service can't necessarily recommend a designated area other than recommended wilderness. I don't think. Beth asked a question if there's been talk of collaborating with tribes on cultural burning projects. This is a really good question. So the Lolo is working really directly with CSKT. CSKT is now considered a cooperating agency on the forest, and I know that they've been in talks with the Nez Perce tribe and some other tribes, but I don't think that they've officially gotten that status. Yes, it's kind of like a separate type of status, cooperating agency, which is the same as like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, where they're working on a government to government basis. So like CSKT wrote sections of the plan at this point. They wrote like a lot of the intro sections for all of the different resources, and they were able to work on specific plan components and write those. In terms of burning projects, this, because it's a forest plan, they don't necessarily authorize specific types of projects, but there is one little component that comes to my mind that I read in the plan that's like specifically says work with the tribes. It's under the fire and WUI, the wildland urban interface section of the plan. There's a standard where it says like the Forest Service will work with the tribes in order to like work together and create burning projects. So it's one of those things where it's kind of like we say that we're going to do that, and then once this plan gets implemented, then the Forest Service at the project level would actually be making the specifics of those projects and the different design criteria and then implementing it. Well, what other questions do people have? Or what would be helpful for folks to get going on comments? We could walk through writing one together, or if people just have questions. Or everyone is now a pro.
Hey, Maddie, Doug Farrell here.
Hi, Doug.
I got a softball question for you.
Okay, I hope I know it.
Okay, so for those of us who are supporters of wild country, when we're writing our comment, and your guidelines are great, they're really helpful, I think. When we're writing our comment, would it be helpful for us to mention these specific areas that are eligible for wilderness in our comment specifically?
Yeah, that would be great. As the more specific you can be, the better for the Forest Service, because then they'll know, like, 100 people said that they love the Cube Iron and they really are asking for recommended wilderness. And so that's what you wanted me to say. So if you can be specific about what you want to see for the recommendations, that's great. And I think the perfect comment in my mind is you have those really specific recommendations, but you also say, like, for you, Doug, like, I live in this area. I've been here for X amount of years. These are like the different things that I love to do in this area. And here are some of my personal experiences being there. And therefore, I think it should be recommended wilderness. So if you can really combine a specific recommendation with your personal experience, that's like the combo for a perfect comment.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Hi, Maddie. This is Zach again.
Hi, Zach.
I have another question, and
Okay.
maybe it's not relevant to this process.
Oh, okay.
But do they do species of conservation concern at the
Mhm.
same time, or is that a separate process?
The answer is both, which is kind of confusing. And that's one of the things that I didn't include here because it can be kind of confusing, but that is a great question. So the species of conservation concern, these are species that are designated as that at a regional level. So the region will say, like, these are the species that are important for the Lolo. And so those are designated at this phase. And they can be designated actually throughout any of the phases of the process. They can change it depending on anything that comes up. And these are species that are not that are not designated under the Endangered Species Act. So they can't be threatened or endangered species. But there are species where the Forest Service has concerns about the longevity of the species existence, basically, and that they think that there needs to be some kind of special plan component that speaks directly to some of these species. So there's always the Forest Service has to have plan components for like general habitat and general species viability, they call it. So that will kind of cover a majority of the species. And then there have to be specific plan components, and there's usually a lot of discussion and analysis around species that were listed under the Endangered Species Act. So grizzly, lynx, and wolverine we'll see in the draft environmental impact statement too. And then the species of conservation concern, those will get extra plan components too. And let me just pull up the list because I don't remember all of it off the top of my head that they designated. There are species of conservation concern for plants and for animals. And so this is all to say that if you have thoughts of other species that you think should be on this list that are not a part of the endangered species list, that you think that there should be extra plan components for, you might as well put it here now, and you can put it in the same comment, even though it's kind of a separate process. 1 minute while I look that up really quick. I'll give you the full list.
And Maddie, if you've had, you've seen unique species or plants on the landscape in your time out there,
Mhm.
like for example, I've seen some carnivorous sensitive plants
Cool.
in the Sealy Swan in the area of one of the detailed maps that you showed. Is it helpful to bring that to the Forest Service's attention in your comment? Or like if I had been lucky enough to see a wolverine in the Cube Iron Cataract, like should I say that?
Yeah, definitely. I would say anything about any kind of species that you've seen. It can also be like, I saw a pika in the Great Burn, like that, even though that's maybe less exciting than like a wolverine. I think it's worth mentioning too. So any kind of special species, plant or animal, it's worth noting if you've seen or if you know that they live in these areas. And kind of similarly noting any like special geographic features that you might know. So like again, with the cube iron, Doug, I know like the name of the cube iron comes because the rock comes off in cubes. Like that is a really unique, cool thing that the Forest Service should be thinking about when they're making these designations and these plan components. So really kind of any fun tidbits you have about the forest, you should definitely share with the Forest Service. Okay, I'm going to share, here's the species of conservation concern, SCC animals list is bighorn sheep. I'm typing this into the chat while I'm reading it. Fisher, harlequin duck, Idaho giant salamander, mountain goat, which I'm really excited about. That's something that we had asked that they add to the list between that first assessment phase and this scoping phase. So I'm really glad they listened to that. And the western pearl shell. The one species that has been on my mind recently that I know is not included here is West Slope cutthroat trout. And so some of those more aquatic species. I know that a lot of the river groups, like American Rivers, that's one species that they would like to see added to this SCC list. So that's one that you could consider too if you know a lot about West Slope cutthroat trout. I'm trying to look for the animals list too. Here we go. Or the plants list. Here are the plants. Oh no, those are just the ones that they added. One moment. Okay, here are the plants, which I'm not as familiar with. So if anyone here is familiar with some of these plants and wants to chat about them, please speak up and tell me about them. Here they are, plant. Any other areas people want to look at any of the maps that we didn't cover in this presentation? Like I said originally, there are so many cool areas across the whole forest. I know that we didn't touch on everything, so please let me know if there are other areas people want to talk about, and we can go look at some of the maps too. Yes, the Great Barren map. How do you feel about this part of the map, Zach? I can also bring up the whole map and we can zoom in depending on what you want to look at. Or there's a lot of other layered maps that we can look at too.
That's great. I just had a question because I was also cooking dinner at the same time as you were talking.
Okay.
What were you saying about the two small roadless areas north of the Hoodoo roadless area and what
Mhm.
recommending?
Yes, so there's a whole bunch of different roadless areas all along the state line that are a mix of motorized and non-motorized. These two in particular, the Ward Eagle roadless area and Meadow Creek Upper North Fork, these are areas that we went out into this summer. Matea and Aaron, who are here on this call, so they can maybe speak to more of it if they would like. Went out into some of these areas and we kind of like evaluated a lot of the different wilderness characteristics like solitude and naturalness and opportunities for quiet recreation. And these are two areas that really stood out as having exceptional wild character. And so these are two areas that we're recommending for wilderness in addition to the Hoodoo Roadless area that's already recommended wilderness.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Are Hub and Hazel Lakes in that Ward Eagle roadless area?
Yeah. And here's a
Great.
photo that I put on this slide from Matea. That's looking down at Hub Lake. Matea, do you want to say anything about that roadless area in particular or anything that you saw while you were there?
Yeah, it is a spectacular area. A lot of variety of forest types too, which was really wonderful to experience. You start out, especially with the Hub and Hazel Lakes Trail, you start out in like an old growth cedar forest with massive cedars, and it climbs through Doug fir forests and then goes up to Hub Lake, where it's more like an alpine forest up there. And then there's also a really rich history too of mining back there. There's an old mining shaft into the side of Ward Mountain. That's totally structurally safe actually. And you can go quite a bit into it. So yeah, I just had so much fun and exploring this area. And yeah, it definitely has a lot of wild character and also a lot of wilderness, or not wilderness, wildlife activity as well. Lots of pika, marmot, saw lots of scat everywhere. So yeah, it's a pretty exceptional place.
Thanks for sharing that.
You know, Maddie, as far as maps go,
Mhm.
if we could take a quick peep at the forest-wide map, the big map,
Mhm.
it sort of shows something really interesting, and that is unseen on this map, immediately northwest of the extreme northwest corner of the Lolo is the Cabinet Mountains Wilderness.
Mhm.
Large area has been protected since 1964.
Mhm.
And so the Cube Iron area and the Great Burn area, you can see on this map that they do a really important job in connecting the Cabinet Mountains Wilderness with the Bitterroot existing wilderness down to the south, and also with the Missions and the Bob Marshall. So
Mhm.
those two areas in particular are sort of helping to provide connectivity to wildlife that treasure wild country.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for showing that, Doug. That's why I think also I'm really excited about that connectivity piece that the Forest Service is doing here, because I feel like that's especially important for the Lolo National Forest because there are some of these different wildlands kind of on the outskirts of the forest or interspersed with the forest. Like the cabinets are just above and the Mission Mountains and down in the Selway Bitterroot, some of the pieces in Idaho. And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what they come up with for that modeling analysis later. Also, Erin, to answer your original question about the trail, and does it go through the extension of Lolo, the research natural area? Let me just go to that map actually really quick. Does it go through this section? I just went and confirmed at the maps and it does not look like it does. I believe it goes up through here, just around it. There might be like a teensy section.
Thanks for looking into that.
Mhm.
That's helpful. What do research natural areas typically, like, is there typically motorized use allowed or mechanized or?
I think it's
You're allowed to enter on foot, correct? Or are you not allowed to enter?
Yes, you are allowed to enter on foot. The actual management varies quite a bit from research natural area to research natural area. I don't think that there are necessarily like certain plan components, like with recommended wilderness, that always go with it. In this area in particular, the plan components for the Carlton Ridge Research Natural Area are no motorized use. But it's basically quiet on mechanized use on mountain biking. It doesn't say anything about that if I'm remembering correctly in the plan. But it does say some things about non-motorized. And let me just pull up that section of the plan actually really quick, and I can share with you what it says specifically.
Thank you. This is helpful. That trail has become increasingly popular for mountain bikers to use, and
Mm.
I really appreciate that you will get to the wilderness boundary sign and often there will be bikes leaning against the tree, and the mountain bikers will stop there and dismount and like continue up to the peak on foot. But it's good that the expansion of the research natural area can happen. It wouldn't affect that very popular mechanized use in that area.
Mhm. Yeah, and so the plan components for the research natural area, right now it says summer motorized travel is not suitable in this area. And it's also not suitable for commercial drone launching or landings. No types of new energy or utility structures, no type of mining or anything can happen there. But it does say winter motorized travel, snowmobiling, could be suitable so long as those uses do not threaten or interfere with the objectives or purposes for which the research natural area is established and are consistent with the management direction in the established record. So that's a really confusing way to say that. And now I'm going to go look at a map to see another piece of that. One second. But it doesn't say anything about mountain biking, which is what I thought. No. But then, so this section would be winter non-motorized. That's what I thought, because then you have to go and look at something we have not talked about because it's very confusing, is the recreation opportunity spectrum maps, which is kind of like an overlay of the whole forest. And that's how you can tell what certain areas are motorized or what certain areas are non-motorized without it having to have like lots of specific pieces in the plan. So you can look at this big map and kind of see what the Forest Service is thinking. And it is non-motorized. It is primitive, overlapping that research natural area. So that's a good thing to flag, because actually I want to say something about that to the Forest Service. Their standard is kind of confusing.
Well, thank you for the deep dive on that area. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, who else has a question? There are still lots of people here on the call. Maybe you all are just furiously typing away on your comments. But any other things people want to talk about? Any like questions that are coming up for people if you are furiously writing away on your comments? Any questions about the logistics of like the portal or where to send things or anything on that kind of side of things? Okay, well, I'm just gonna hang out here. You all tell me when there's questions or things people want to talk about if it comes up for you in your writing. I hope this has been helpful so far.
This has been super helpful. Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you, Erin. Are there any other resources people feel like they need to have to write their comments? We really only like scratched the surface, I would say, in terms of all the different parts of the plan, because it is so nuanced and there's so many different things, but there's lots of other like maps and documents and things that I can share if that would be helpful to folks if there are certain issues you might be interested in that we didn't really touch on. So let me know about that.
I know I've asked a lot of questions, so I'll
Please.
eat other people's space, but is there like a reference for what criteria the forest looks at when recommending wilderness? Like, I know there's like general things, but like in the Helena Lewis and Clark Forest Plan, they made up some reasons for not recommending wilderness for like because it was an odd shape.
Mm-hmm.
So is there like a reference that we could look at?
Yes. So I think that what you're referring to is going to come later in the draft environmental impact statement phase. So right now there is an appendix on the web page. Let me just send you all the whole web page with all the documents. One second. There is an appendix that they're calling their wilderness evaluation. And that's something that you can comment on too. And it kind of just says what they're thinking in terms of some of the different criteria for different areas. But it's not a narrative of like, we're going to recommend this area because it has these values just yet. That will be a whole section of the draft environmental impact statement because when they do their different alternatives during that phase, there will likely be one that has a lot more recommended wilderness, one that has a lot less, and they're going to have to bring in all of that criteria and all that information to kind of justify those different decisions. So that I think I know what you're referring to, and I think that that's going to come later because right now we kind of just have some thoughts from the Forest Service essentially about some of these topics. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, I couldn't remember when that came out.
Yeah. And let me just share. So this link here, and then I see there's two other questions coming in. So one moment. Okay, here we go. This folder on the Forest Service page that I just put into the chat, that has all of the different parts of the plan. So the plan itself is what they call the proposed action. It's like 250 pages, and then they have lots of different maps. And then there's the wilderness evaluation, which is Appendix 6 in this thing. And that's where they'll say like the cube iron roadless area. Like here's what we think in terms of naturalness, but they'll just kind of like list a few things. But the full narrative analysis of all of those criteria comes later. Another appendix that might be of interest to folks is Appendix 11. This is something that the Forest Service very nicely put together for us at this thing that I've never seen the Forest Service do before on any other project or plan, which they're calling their Appendix 11 Reader's Guide. And the Reader's Guide will say like, if you're interested in, I don't know what's a topic we haven't touched on, like grazing or something, you can scroll through it's alphabetically listed and you can go to like the grazing section and it'll tell you every different page of the plan and all of the different plan components that talk about that one issue that you might be interested in. And so that's a really handy resource for folks if you're interested in doing that. Someone asked a question to me directly about copying maps and information on the portal. Steve, if you'd be willing to share maybe what format you're writing your comment in, I think maybe I could help you. Are you on an iPad? Are you on your computer on a Word document? Where are you typing your comment right now? I'm going to click ask to unmute on your little square if you're able to do that. Maybe that would be helpful.
Maddie, my
Yeah.
comment as a kind of techno peasant, as I said, is I see the chats, but then how do I save that so that once the Zoom is over, I can go back and know exactly how to access that material?
I gotcha. So like the documents that I shared, the recommendation documents.
Yeah, correct.
So for those, if you hover over them, and I can put them again in the chat so they're fresh on the bottom. If you hover over it, there should be a little arrow that says download. Do you see that?
Okay.
And so you should be able to download it right to your computer. I promise I didn't put any
Okay.
viruses on it or anything.
All right. Okay.
And in that document on the first page, I did put that same link to the comment portal and everything that you'll need to reference later if you want to do it that way.
Okay.
Did that help?
Yep, that's it. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Beth asked a question. What potential is there for the Forest Service to designate or improve access for more concentrated recreation areas in the Missoula area? I think that they definitely could if you have some specific suggestions to put forward to the Forest Service. Because we're still at that first kind of rough draft phase, they're really open to any kind of suggestions you might have if there's an area that you think should really be focused on recreation use. I'm just going to go back to that original first map here so you can see the areas. I don't know if that's a good enough zoomed in zoom map. But if you have specific suggestions where you think that their management should really focus on recreation and some of that infrastructure, you can definitely let them know that now. That's kind of a newer type of management area that's specific to this Lolo plan. So there's not a lot of like criteria or policies that they have to follow in creating these areas. It's really up to their discretion. And so I think that they'd be willing to hear any kind of feedback you have on that topic specifically.
That's a great question, Beth, and it makes me think about an area that is, I believe, in the process of being acquired by the Lolo, which is Deep Creek. Maddie, are you familiar with that area?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it's still in the process of being acquired and that isn't complete, although maybe it is, you can update us. You know, is it appropriate here to say, like, should the acquisition of this area become complete, it should be potentially considered for inclusion in the concentrated recreation use, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. You could definitely, because this is a long process, I don't know if I really touched actually on the timeline when I was going over the timeline of the Lolo, but here we are in 2024. This plan likely won't be completed until late 2026 at the very earliest, if not into 2027 or later. And so by that time, maybe they would have acquired the land. And when they acquire the land, it has to go under the forest plan under some kind of management. So I think that it's worth looking at. And something that I was just thinking, and I can bring up the map on my computer, is the Lolo did something that I've also never seen before on a forest, which is they identified their like priority land acquisition sections of the map. And so there's some areas where they talk about like these are areas where we're focused on acquiring lands, or like an area that's like really checkerboarded where like they might want to prioritize some kind of acquisition in the future. And let me just bring up that map and look 1 second.
Great. And while you're doing that,
Mhm.
Beth, are you willing to share whether there's any particular spaces around Missoula that you think are good candidates for this type of use? All right, well, the floor is open for everyone else to make suggestions then. Thanks, Beth Ann.
Okay.
The map is really small, but as I look at it, it looks like Blue Mountain is currently a concentrated recreation use area. Looks like Patty Canyon and all of the Sentinel Forest Service lands are in that dark purple. All of the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area looks like Snowball is as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Lolo Pass. Did you say that in Lookout Pass?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's a kind of a teensy. You can't. This map is not particularly fantastic to show those little pieces. Okay.
Oh, there
I'm
we
just
go.
gonna stop sharing the screen and I'm gonna share. Oh, Beth, I can try to unmute you from here if you want to say something.
I figured
Oh,
it out.
there you are. Hi.
Yep. I'm sorry.
You're good.
No, I'm quite interested in areas that other people may have, I don't know, may think, oh, doesn't everybody know about this spot? Because it seems like it gets quite a bit of use. Areas that, yeah, seem like kind of no-brainers to make a little more accessible.
Mhm.
And I feel pretty ignorant asking the question because I'm not quite sure how that whole process happens. But Maddie, like you said, it sounds as though that portion of the plan is sort of new territory for the Lolo as well.
Yeah.
That's all.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's because we're at this early phase, like this is the perfect time to think about what would be your perfect forest plan and put those suggestions forward. And I think even if you're not like this specific, geotagged location should be a concentrated recreation area, you could even say to the Forest Service in your comment something like, I'm really interested in designating more concentrated recreation use areas around Missoula. And you could make that more high level too, if you want to, if there's not like a specific place that comes to mind. Or you can also do both. You can say like, I'm really interested in this and maybe Deep Creek is one of those areas or wherever maybe that's going to be.
And I know you mentioned, desire not just to have more areas, but also to improve access. And I would just encourage you, as Maddie has, to be specific about that. Like, how do you define access and how could that be improved? That will be helpful for the Forest Service to know.
Sweet. And yeah, I'll need to take a look at places friends have led me to and, think, okay, is this an area that gets enough use now that it would make sense to encourage greater use of it? That is as opposed to sort of putting up a big "come here" sign to some of our favorite less accessible places that maybe have enough wilderness characteristics that we don't want to,
Mhm.
run into. I'm not even sure I'm framing that it's the right way.
Yeah. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And there's also a lot of other recreation components of the plan that kind of apply across the forest. So there's usually some things around like access to trailheads or maintaining trails at kind of like a higher level. Like the Forest Service wants certain trails to be maintained in certain ways that will apply across the forest, not necessarily just to the concentrated recreation area. So they'll have some different recreation pieces across the land. And I was just going to try to pull those up, but I was also going to try to show you this other map. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. Sorry, I'm going back and forth between two different computers, if that was not obvious this whole time. And then I'm going to try to share this screen. Okay. Cool. So this map shows in the purple hatches what they're calling their acquired land restoration emphasis area. Erin, can you remind me the place that you just said? Sorry, I got distracted looking for this map.
Deep Creek.
Deep Creek, which is over here. I don't know. I have to go look at another map to confirm that this is where Deep Creek is. Because I think that this
It's one of those names where there's multiple places probably with that name, even on the Lolo, but
Oh, you're
it's
not
pretty
right.
tight to the community of Missoula on the southwestern side.
Oh, I was thinking of a different area that's called Deep Creek. Okay, never mind. Then I'm not sure what you're talking about. Sorry. On the southwestern side. Okay, so here we are. This would be like Blue Mountain, I think. Right in here. Do you know if it's on this map? Do you see a square that looks familiar to you? I know
Yeah, so what are the purple hatches?
those are the ones that they're calling their um, acquired land restoration emphasis areas.
Okay, so yeah, it's probably the one that's just, there's a little orange rectangle. It's
Yes.
probably the collection of purple hatched areas just to the left of there.
This section here.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
Okay. And then I brought up, this is the plan, and this is their section they have about acquired restoration emphasis areas, which I don't see. Oh, this is just by location. So it's not
So
going to say.
it would be lumped into Greater Missoula there in the second line.
Exactly. So it'd be some amount of acres in this 36,000 acres. And so it looks like a lot of the plan standards have to do with looking at some of the old roads in some of these areas, some kind of like remedial forest activities. It also says acquired land support a variety of recreation uses and opportunities. That's kind of interesting. But yeah, so maybe that could be an area. There was some other thing that I was going to look at on this map that I already forgot. Does anyone remember what we were going to look at on this map? Or one of the maps? Okay.
I guess
Well,
looking for any areas that
Hmm.
people might recognize as,
Mhm.
I don't know, potential for more concentrated recreation use, you know,
mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, what suggestions do folks have that are here on the call? Anything immediately come to mind? This is kind of a zoomed in around the Missoula area. So again, the concentrated recreation use is in purple.
Maddie, if you go back to the one with the crosshatches that
Oh.
identify like acquisition potential opportunities.
Mhm.
Beth Ann, the area that's to the east of the designated rattlesnake wilderness and the national recreation area is a lot of land that's been acquired as it's been divested from timber companies. And the Nature Conservancy has been managing it and transitioning it slowly to the Bureau of Land Management and then to the Forest Service accordingly. And I think that, you know, in Missoula parlance, that's often referred to as the Gold Creek area. And I think that there's recreation interest in developing some concentrated use there. I've heard from the Missoula Nordic Club that that might be a potential area for development of additional cross-country ski trails and things like that. So that might also be a potential, and that's not too far off from where the fat biking trails are groomed by MTB Missoula. So I think all those crosshatches that you see to the south and east of that dark purple area could have potential for concentrated use areas.
Yeah, that's a
Thank
good
you.
idea.
Great, yeah.
Sorry,
And
Matt.
that would be higher elevation in some cases, which could be of interest to winter, yeah, recreation users.
Yeah, and separately, you might be interested, the BLM is starting to look at their acquired land, which I believe is on this kind of gray section because it's not part of the forest in this area, and trying to look at developing other recreation opportunities there. And Aaron, I haven't heard, are they going to be giving some of those parcels to the Forest Service? It was my understanding that it was just the BLM primarily for those.
In that gray area where you were mousing, I think that those will primarily stay in Bureau of Land Management.
Okay.
And I think that there might be a comment period opening up shortly on some of that land. So keep in touch with us, Beth Ann, on that.
Yeah, but I think I heard last that they're kind of working on developing their proposed action. So essentially the same phase that we're at here on the Lolo. And I think they're aiming for around May to have that out for a public comment period. So more public comments.
Great, that's a great tip. Thank you.
Yeah. Good idea, Erin. Cool. Any other maps folks want to look at while I have? This is the whole map packet that the Forest Service has on the website, and that link that I linked earlier. Actually, I can't see if there's any chats. Okay, no chats. But there's a lot of other different maps that we could look at if you're interested in. The Forest Service, this is kind of the proposed action map. This is one that they're doing, which has to do with watershed condition networks, where they're looking at kind of like whole watershed blobs for their conditions. We have some other pieces around the recreation opportunity spectrum, which basically means like, are some of these areas motorized or non-motorized? There's separate maps for that. This is also an interesting map. They have what they call scenic integrity objective maps. That has to do with kind of how they're managing some of the areas around these. So like they can't have certain activities that are going to impede basically like view sheds and things like that. This is the timber map. There's different levels of timber harvest that can occur across the forest. And this is kind of like the underlying analysis for that. Yeah, there's a lot of maps. We can look at any of them. Bye, Erin. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. People, please feel free to leave if you need to leave. I will stay here until every last question is answered if there are other questions that come up. Or if you just need time to work on your comment, I'm happy to sit here in case questions come up. But don't feel pressure to, because we're still here. Okay, I'm going to go back up to the proposed action map just to be the main map we have going on the screen.
Maddie, it looks like there are a couple of areas that Vital Ground, the organization that buys land for connectivity, so they're a land trust. There are a couple of areas, I just looked on their website, where projects seem to be on the Lolo or adjacent to the Lolo Forest. One of them is Donovan Creek, which is maybe in that Gold Creek larger area. It's east of Missoula. And it may be, let's see, just looking on their details here. I'm not sure if it's had Nature Conservancy, I'm not sure if they've been involved with it, but it's just a 34-acre easement. Protecting wildlife movement across the Clark Fork. Located near the confluence of Donovan Creek and an I-90 underpass used. So if anybody is familiar with those areas, those could carry some weight, I would think. That one, and then the other one I saw is Falls Creek, on the edge of the Cabinets. Don't know if that is directly adjacent to the Lolo, but it's in the area that, like you were saying, the Cabinets and the importance of, or something. Yeah, if I remember correctly, I actually submitted a letter of support for that Falls Creek project on behalf of Wild Montana for Vital Ground. And I think that project is in the Kootenai National Forest, technically. The other one, Donovan Creek, I'm not very familiar with, so I'm not sure. But you just brought up a thought in my mind too, which is that there's a lot of recently acquired timberland. Oh, I don't know if any of these maps are going to show it. Well, it's basically up here in this top kind of corner section. Do you see my mouse? Oh, sorry, it's still scrolling, it looks like. Okay, up in here. There's a lot of newly acquired lands that was like really heavily logged when it was private land, and then the Forest Service has taken over the management of that land. And I think that if they wanted it to be like a, concentrated recreation area or whatever, it would have to be, I think first there would have to be some kind of like
restoration work put into place. Because I think that it's like pretty heavily logged and they might have some like restoration things that would need to happen. But then it could maybe be some kind of concentrated use, recreation use. So, you know, what might be a good comment is something like the Forest Service should seriously consider any of their recently acquired lands as areas where they could consider more concentrated recreation use or something like that, without having to get too far into the specifics.
And in fact, I was bringing up vital ground, not with a mind towards concentrated recreation use, but
Oh.
rather the interconnectivity and
Mhm.
conservation benefits of considering the proximity to those areas. And it
Yeah.
looks like for the Falls Creek area, there is already collaboration with the Forest Service. So like you said, it's probably on the Kootenai.
Yeah, I would guess it's similar probably for the Donovan area, like what the BLM is doing, where the Nature Conservancy is coming in and kind of restoring some of these lands, because some of them were really heavily used for logging when they were private. And so there's usually like a huge web of road networks and all sorts of different things. And so I know for at least for the BLM section of land that's over here in Gold Creek, they're looking at restoring some of the roads so that they're more revegetated and it's more natural, but also keeping a lot of those old road systems to provide for trails and recreation opportunities around that area. So anyways, it's an interesting thought and one that I hadn't thought much about at this point. So I'm really glad that you brought up this question. Thank you.
And isn't there some kind of a project, some kind of a bike path through that area that the Missoula Community Foundation maybe has been involved in? I hope I'm not mixing up too many entities and concepts, but there's some kind of, it's got a capitalized name, blah, 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 trail. That I remember hearing about maybe 3 years ago. But
Over in this over in this Gold Creek area?
Yeah, it's meant to connect, I think, ultimately to the Sealy Swan Valley. So it may be using existing roads. And maybe it does cross a lot of BLM managed land. I don't know. Yeah, I didn't get to see a map of it. It's just a tantalizing sounding thing that I think there was fundraising going on, and that was the context that I heard about.
That doesn't ring any bells to me, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I'm gonna do a little Googling here. I was thinking of the like rail trail, which is over, that's like way over because it goes into Idaho. So that's a different thing.
Yes, this is different. This is connecting the more or less the rattlesnakes and the missions, I think you could say, or it's meant to provide some access.
Does anyone else on the call know about this path? Is it like a paved bike path or more of a primitive mountain bike kind of path?
I imagine it's primitive, and I don't know exactly
what the
goal would be, but yeah, you're mentioning that there is a lot of BLM land with a lot of existing roads. And reminded me, oh yeah, there's that project I do remember hearing about. Like I said, the Missoula Community Foundation somehow must have been involved with some fundraising.
Okay.
Maybe it's in a very preliminary stage at this point.
Does anyone else on this call know what this is? Oh, is it this? The Rattlesnake Greenway just came up on my Google search.
Maybe a more in-town thing. That name doesn't sound, and I have heard more about that. Yeah, when do I look a little bit?
Well, let me know if it comes to you here. I'm also going to put my email into the chat so you have it. And please feel free to let me know if you have any questions that come up about forest planning. I'm happy to answer any of them. I probably should have given my email when everyone was still here. Okay.
Maddie, can I ask a kind of wonky question?
Oh yeah.
This kind of goes back to my last question, but like, how much does the forest have to consider things outside of potential recommended wilderness boundaries affecting like a
Mm.
chance for solitude?
What
Like, because in the east, like there's recommended wilderness that comes right up to a highway,
Mm.
essentially.
Mhm.
Like, and so like your chance for solitude is pretty limited near that, but once you get away from there, it's quickly pretty becomes your chance for solitude increases. Like, so
Yeah.
like, and past activities, like if there's a former timber sale but the road isn't evident, like,
Yeah.
sorry, I'll quit there.
Yeah, I'm totally following your question. So that's something that they'll consider as a criteria. And I would say it's likely that like an area will get kind of dinged points if you're thinking about it as like a point system, which it is not a point system, but hypothetically, if they did it that way, because I think it kind of makes sense when you're thinking about their evaluation. If they were to give it some kind of points, I think that would make it so that they have less points, but it wouldn't preclude an area from being considered for recommended wilderness. Areas of past vegetation treatment is one of the pieces that comes up quite a bit. And it's kind of up to Forest Service discretion on do they consider it, quote, substantially noticeable or not? And so that has to do with like how things have regrown or how they haven't regrown. And the Chapter 70 handbook about wilderness evaluation says that places with past vegetation treatment can be recommended wilderness so long as some of those treatments are not fully substantially noticeable. So that piece, it kind of depends. And I would say the Forest Service uses a lot of kind of like GIS or like different kind of data. Um, so they have like their what am I trying to say? They have like their own database basically where they say like these are all the different timber treatments we've done on this forest over the past 60 years. And so they can go in and they can kind of model like likely what some of the landscapes look like. And that's what they're basing these wilderness evaluation criteria on. So I would say on that piece, if there's a specific parcel that you're thinking of, if you know what it looks like, or if you have photos of what that specific area looks like, it might be worth sharing that with the Forest Service of being like, well, I have on the ground knowledge of this area and I know that these trees have grown back or like this road has been revegetated or whatever it might be. So there's that piece. In terms of the highway piece, again, that's like pretty up to the Forest Service. And I would say like when you're looking at the solitude criteria for that, you're looking at like the parcel as a whole. And so like you can easily make an argument of like if there is a highway on one side, but like the rest of the parcel is super quiet, remote, kind of area, you can say like just because it has a highway on one side doesn't preclude the rest of the area from being recommended wilderness. I just wrote something about this recently because I think you can easily make the case of like, well, the Wilderness Act is allowing for designated wilderness near highways all across the country. And if Congress, at the intention of the Wilderness Act, didn't want them to be close to the highway, they could have said something about that explicitly, but they didn't. And so as long as you're looking at kind of like the whole parcel, I think you can make that case. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Mhm. Craig, do you have any questions or anything coming up for you that you want to chat about? Not to put you on the spot. Thanks, Zach. Have a good night. Thanks, Beth. Thanks for all your questions and discussion. That was really interesting and something that I'm going to definitely keep thinking about too. So thank you so much for coming. And please let me know if you have any questions or anything else comes up in your comment writing journey. Craig, let us know if you need help with anything or if there's anything you want to chat about. Matea, since it's just the three of us, I'll ask you a question, which is, what did you think of the materials? Are there anything you think we should improve for the in-person workshops?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think might help folks maybe just kind of locate these landscapes a little easier is
Mm.
like mentioning popular landmarks or popular hiking trails, like with
Mhm.
Reservation Divide being like, this is where Chappaqua Peak is,
Yeah.
or the Great Burn is where Heart Lake is, or
Mhm.
you know, like pretty common trails or landmarks for those areas, because I think some people have been there, they just might not know that that's
Yeah.
what the area is called.
Okay,
So I don't know. That was like the only thing that I came up with so far.
cool. That's good to know. I was also originally thinking I like had the whole map and then I had like some slides where I like zoomed in, then I went back to the whole map and then I kept zooming back in. But that felt like so many extra
Mm.
slides, so I didn't do that. But anyways,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but I like your idea better. Um,
I think what was the other thing? No, never mind. Yeah, other than that, I mean, a lot of information, but also like good stops for people to like, you know, ask questions if needed.
yeah. Okay. I think it'll be good in person because then we can like, have it be more interactive too with the writing portion.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to do over
Yeah.
Zoom. But oh, the other thing I was thinking about is if folks want to look at like a physical copy besides the one that we'll have of like the proposed action, besides the one that we'll have at the workshop.
Mhm.
Just mentioning that there's one at the public library in Missoula, and there's also one at the public library in Mineral County. I don't know about Sealy or Stevensville, but and then also I know in Mineral County, at least at the ranger offices, they have little
Yeah.
thumb drives with it on there that people can download it.
Yeah. At
And
every district they do.
okay, cool.
I did not print out the proposed action, or I have not yet, because I printed out kind of a ridiculous amount of paper for all the rest of the handouts, and I was like, is it worth it or not? I don't know. What do you think? Because
Yeah.
I'm gonna bring both of my computers, and I figured we could have like one computer with the proposed action up, but I don't know. Maybe it's
Mhm.
not. I'm hoping that a lot of people have a device with them, and we can print
Right.
site.
Yeah. I think probably just on the computer is fine. Or like, yeah, and one tab can be directly to Appendix 11 or whatever that appendix is that goes directly to those different sections. Because I have a feeling that that will be like one of the most key parts of the proposed action that folks will want to look at.
Yeah, I printed out 2 copies of that appendix, but maybe
Okay.
more.
Hmm.
Think about them. Okay.
At least that's what the Forest Service was really pushing in Mineral County when I went to that meeting. That's what they were
Really
pushing
nice.
folks to look.
Yeah, put that together.
Yeah.
Cool.
Um, yeah. I can also bring my personal laptop too.
Okay.
And we'll just have a lot of extra devices for folks if they want to do that, or yeah, stationary.
Okay. Yeah, I bought today. I started with like 50 envelopes and then like a giant pad of like lined paper and then like a bunch of extra pens and stamps. And I figured we would just see how it goes on at the Missoula meeting and if you need to get more or not. I have no sense.
Totally.
So
Sounds good. Yes. And I got a bunch of treats and stuff
great. Thank you.
today. So,
Great.
yes. Yeah, I didn't know if it was the same cookies that you're talking about, but there was like these mini chocolate chip cookies. There's
Yes,
like
those are the
60 of them. I was like, perfect.
That's it. Yeah. I'll rebought
Yeah.
3 things for a meeting in Billings, and I was like, this is way too many cookies.
They look pretty tasty, so I have a feeling they might go quickly.
Nice.
But
Craig, I'm wondering if you're still with us. If you wanted to give me like an emoji or like a chat or something to let me know, or if you walked away from your computer, maybe I'll end the meeting. I'll give you a second. But if you're still working, no rush. Okay. Hearing nothing, I think I'm going to end the meeting now. I'm very slowly going to do it in case you're just struggling with the technology to tell me that you're still here. Okay. Your machine. Okay, well, have a good night. Thank you for coming.
yeah, have
I'll
a good
see you
night.
tomorrow, Mateo.
That's good. See you tomorrow.